Hello and welcome to Art Snaps, which is where I, Katie Ackrell, talk about Swindon's art collection, which is full of gorgeous paintings and works on paper, which were made by some of the most significant artists working in Britain from the late 1800s right up until today. Now, if you're a regular listener, you'll notice that I often introduce these episodes by claiming that I'm celebrating Swindon Museum and Art Gallery's modern art collection, which is true. But you may have also noticed that I almost always include artworks by contemporary artists in the episodes too. And I don't need to tell you that that's because the contemporary art in the collection is obviously just as important as the modern art, and it shows how current artistic practices respond to both new and time-honoured themes in art. And of course, contemporary artworks can also bring fresh perspectives to the modern artworks in the collection. So, today I'm going to focus on some amazing contemporary painting, particularly because this is an aspect of the collection which has really grown in the past few years. And if you're wondering what the difference between modern and contemporary art is, that's totally fair enough because it can be quite difficult to define where that boundary is. But I think the easiest way to think about that is to consider living artists who are responding creatively to the world around them and developing new and interesting practices as contemporary, and perhaps artists of the 20th century who have passed away or are no longer creating as modern artists. The artworks I'm going to discuss today are by artists who are currently practicing and residing in the UK, and they all have work included in one particular donation to Swindon Museum and Art Gallery, which happened back in 2013 by an artist-led organisation called Contemporary British Painting. And this extraordinary collection includes 40 works of art by 24 leading artists from across the country and demonstrates the huge variety of painting practices which are happening right now. And I'm aware that this is quite a long introduction, so some of these are flashing up on the screen as I speak. I've decided to talk in detail about 3 pieces from the donation, which we actually often call the Prizeman donation, after Robert Prizeman, who co-founded Contemporary British Painting and worked with Swindon Museum and Art Gallery to bring the collection to Swindon. So I'll discuss 3 pieces which I've chosen because they speak to me for different reasons, and they're pieces that I remember when I'm thinking about the donation. And these are by Nicholas Middleton, Susan Gunn and Simon Carter. I'll begin with Subway by Nicholas Middleton because I'm always intrigued by the incredible photographic realism of this piece, which is so precise that on first, second, and maybe even third glance, it really looks like a photo. But the more you look, the more you see the touch of the artist's brush, and you could spend ages in front of it unravelling this idea of the photograph and developing your understanding of it as a painting. And in the process, you're taking in all the different textures and shape that Middleton has so skillfully rendered. So it's a really interesting viewing experience when you see it in the flesh, so to speak, because you're always questioning what you're seeing and being surprised by what you're discovering. And I think that with a painting like this, people are always interested to know, how did the artist do it? How did they achieve such precision? Obviously, great skill comes into it to a large degree, but I was also interested to learn that Middleton's process gives him complete control over the image from start to finish. He begins by taking a photo with a film camera and developing it himself and then creating a painting from that image, rather than using a pre-existing image. And this control also extends to the painting process, which involves the traditional method of creating a grid on a canvas to get the proportions right. So in this sense, there's kind of quite an interesting relationship with traditional or conventional modes of painting, of creating a painting. But of course, the subject matter itself is far from traditional. Middleton gives us a scene of urban ruin and abandon here. I'm not sure why he specifically chose this photo to paint from, but in an interview he expressed an interest in the ephemeral nature of things that initially seem quite solid, which is really interesting. So maybe this piece has something to do with the idea of the useful becoming kind of banal and inadequate. This subway was built for a purpose and was probably used on a daily basis, and people trusted its solidity, but now it's structurally unsound, useless and deserted. And the photorealist technique that Middleton employs really forces us to assess a scene that we might otherwise ignore or find unsightly. The second painting I want to talk about today is Susan Gunn's Broken Ground, which is a small but striking piece in the collection. It's only 30 centimetres square, but that powerful blue really packs a punch. And once the viewer's drawn in, it slowly reveals a surface of intricate cracks and black kind of nicks or scars. But despite its contemporary and abstract character, Gunn's work makes greater links to artistic traditions than we might first imagine. To start with, the surface is made from a medium called gesso, which is traditionally used to form the ground on which an artist paints their image. But here, Gunn uses the gesso as the subject of the painting itself, applying layer upon layer and altering different factors of the process to create different surfaces. And what's interesting about this is the push and pull between accident and intent. The artist purposefully engineers the piece so that cracks will appear, altering factors like the consistency of the gesso and the temperature and the speed at which it's allowed to dry out. Yet she can't predict where and how the cracks will appear. And this dialogue between accident and intent is also reflected in Gunn's use of the golden section, which is another traditional reference which goes back to the Renaissance of the 14 and 1500s, when it was used by the likes of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo to create geometrically balanced compositions. So the line directly down the middle of the work creates a visual contrast between the unpredictable mark making and geometric precision. So Broken Ground is a painting which is an amazing example of practice which plays with these traditional techniques to create a really interesting and contemporary aesthetic. And I love the fact that it doesn't tell the viewer too much. It's kind of this surface which enables us to project our own experiences onto the work. And in this sense, I think it's quite meditative. It gives us space and opportunity for reflection and contemplation. To end, we have another very different approach to painting from Simon Carter. We have two pieces by Carter in the collection, both of which are very different, but which respond to landscapes in a very gestural and expressive way with a very vivid use of colour. The piece on the slide, which is called Burnt Gorse, has this great, immediate and impactful character to it. And as you can see, it isn't a clear, realistic representation of a landscape, but instead Carter gives us the sense of hot land juxtaposed with cool water. And those incredible angular marks look like they could represent either rocks or undulations in the land, or perhaps the gorse alluded to in the title. And this is because Carter's work is all about observing and responding to the changing landscape and focusing on elements which are unexpected and surprising rather than repeating directly what's in front of him. So in this sense, it's very different from what we saw with Middleton's meticulous photorealism. Instead, he's just responding to particular characteristics which have stood out to him whilst making his primary sketches, or which he's remembered later on when he's in his studio. So I think Carter's work continues the strong tradition of landscape painting in British art, in the way that he expresses a sense of place, and uses the landscape as an arena for experimentation and emotional response. He closely observes the landscape that he's familiar with, where he lives and works on the East Coast, and brings its unique characteristics to our attention. And this is something that we can trace back to the most famous of landscape artists, such as William Turner and John Constable. And I want to end with that mention of historical painting, because when I was doing my research for this episode, I became very interested in the fact that in some way, each of these three artists allude to certain traditions in their approach to painting, which I suppose in a way is quite difficult not to do when painting is one of the most traditional of mediums. But I feel that they do this in quite a conscious way, and it's quite amazing because they celebrate or utilise traditional practices to bring painting into the 21st century and respond in their own way to the world around them. And I'll leave you on that interesting note and say thank you so much for listening. And if you've enjoyed this, please do feel free to listen to any of our other episodes of Art Snaps, which are available through YouTube, and maybe even visit our Art on Tour blog, which is www.swindonmuseumandartgallery.org.uk/artontour. Just a little plug to end on there. Thank you so much for listening. Take care and bye for now.